We have responsibility to be stewards of our beautiful small planet's future, because this is the home for the future generations. You talked about the financing gap. We would never close it if we rely on the generosity of rich countries, because it is too big to be closed with public money. So, most important here and in the months to follow is to work relentlessly to create opportunities for private investments to take place in the developing world.
Hello everyone, I'm Beena Venkatraman. I'm a columnist at the Washington Post and editor-at-large for Strategy and Innovation. I am delighted to be on stage today with Kristalina Georgieva, who is the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Thank you for being with us today.
Great pleasure, great audience.
So you are leading an institution, the IMF, that arose in the 1940s in response to the need to rebuild economies after the Great Depression and then subsequently after World War II. Why on earth is climate change a priority of the IMF today?
It is a priority because our mandate is to help our members achieve macroeconomic and financial stability, growth, and employment. Climate change presents a risk to macroeconomic and financial stability, and on the flip side, climate action generates opportunities for green growth and green jobs. We think of our role as helping our members integrate climate considerations in their fiscal policy, in their monetary policy, in the way they pursue financing. And this is what we have been doing from the origins of the IMF, except that in 1944, people were not worried about climate crisis. Now we do, and rightly so. It would have been an omission of responsibility for the IMF not to deploy our economic analysis to help countries pursue their growth and employment objectives, their macro stability objectives, recognizing the risks and seizing the opportunities.
Does a success story come to mind where the IMF has been shaping either green growth or allowing countries to respond to climate risk?
Well, I can give you a number of examples when the IMF has been instrumental to help countries come with better policies. For example, in Austria, we engaged to see whether there can be an eco-tax that is politically viable in the country. And Austria did move with it 2 years later. So there is a tax, carbon tax, the revenues of which feed into supporting the most vulnerable people. When we think of subsidy removal, you know that in many countries there is still a lot that is benefiting rich people by subsidizing fossil fuels. We work to make sure that these subsidies are eliminated. It's good for the economy, it's good for climate. Does the audience know how much the world spends in fossil fuel subsidies? You do? You don't? You
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know the number.
Last year,
Yeah.
last year, $800 billion went into fossil fuel subsidies. If you take also the indirect cost that come from air pollution, from people dying from it, that come from not pricing carbon appropriately, the total amount of subsidies is $6.5 trillion. 6.5% of global GDP. So what we do is we help countries to see how they can have a rational economic policy, good for their businesses, good for their people, good for climate.
Okay, your point is well taken about Austria and this model of a green tax that is not regressive but progressive. But we know that a lot of the climate financing that's needed around the world is needed in the developing world, where it can truly serve the global poor as well as help countries make the clean energy transition or even leapfrog the energy transition. And about 94% of global climate finance today is mobilized as debt or equity, not as climate aid, which means people are expecting a return on their investment, a world you know very well. But we're seeing some retrenchment in that investment in certain countries because of the perceived and real risks, whether it's armed conflict or poverty or other aspects. How do we effectively mobilize these climate finance strategies to the places where they're needed most?
For the fund, that translates into 3 objectives. Number 1, help countries create good investment environment. Transparency in how they function, push back on corruption. All other things equal, investors, whether they are investors in health and education or in renewable energy, they need good investment climate, and this is what we support countries to do. Number 2, we work with countries to identify where they can introduce more incentives and they can use their own tax money more effectively to shift the economy towards a greener performance. And we do that by engaging with countries through our so-called Article 4 consultations. This is annual checkup. We check the well-being of economies around the world, and we look at ways in which they can more specifically address their climate objectives. And number 3, we recognize that in the environment we operate today, growth is slow, debt is high. And therefore, we can concentrate a lot of our work to help countries with good debt management, but also help countries that are already crushed by heavy burden of debt to restructure this debt so they can open up space for their policy objectives.
So some world leaders, including Barbados' Prime Minister Mia Mottley, have argued for more reforms actually to the IMF process versus their own approach to debt, to restructuring that debt. So for example, the notion that when a country faces a severe climate event, a climate shock, an extreme weather event, there have been requests that the IMF reconsider some of its policies, like the schedule of loan repayments or even pausing those repayments. What is your view on those kinds of reforms to the IMF's policies themselves?
So I agree very much with Mia Mottley that we need to think about the world not of yesterday, but of today and the future. And in this world, we know countries are going to be more frequently hit by exogenous shocks. We saw it in this last couple of years when a pandemic and then a war and then energy price shock have impacted countries dramatically. And of course, poorer countries are much more severely impacted. So we have to think about the way we finance these countries, including at the IMF. What we have done so far is we have created some time ago, and we have utilized it actively, an instrument called Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust. What it is a vehicle to take donor money, grant money, and then pass it to our poorest members when they are experiencing these exogenous shocks. In other words, they have done nothing wrong, but they're suffering. When the first time, by the way, we used it was in Haiti. During the pandemic, we disbursed close to $1 billion to give countries money, so they pay us for 2 years in a row from these grants. They don't have to choose whether they pay the IMF and protect their good status or they look after their own people. We will work on replenishing it and then thinking of these climate-related events as a very likely reason to deploy this instrument. The second thing we have done at the fund, and Mia Motley was among the first to enjoy the benefit of it, we created for the first time in our history a long-term financial instrument. Normally, the fund provides loans 10 years, maturity, 3 to 4 years grace. For this structural transformation that climate change requires, we created a 20-year maturity, 10.5-year grace concessional instruments that countries like Barbados can benefit from. Mind you, it used to be that concessional finance was linked only to income per capita. Barbados is richer. Normally, they're not eligible for concessional finance, but with this instrument, it is called Resilience and Sustainability Trust, we can finance countries like Barbados. And by the way, in Barbados, we did something really beautiful. So imagine the country is squeezed, very little fiscal space. They borrowed from us. They created a blue-green bank. They put this money from the fiscal space into it, expanded attractiveness for private investment. So my point is that we recognize the world is changing. We have to change. Right now, we are working very hard to get our members to bring down the cost of borrowing from the fund because of this very high debt environment and heavy burden on the shoulders of members. And I am very much in agreement with Mia Motley that we have to continue to think, to innovate, to do what has never been done because we are faced with problems we have never faced before.
Yeah, I want to ask you about how you make the case for that because, of course, we're going into another COP with Azerbaijan, and it feels like the same arguments keep getting made, which is, you know, the rich countries of the world have developed with the benefit of fossil fuels, yet the poorer countries of the world are experiencing the most harm. So we know that there's this moral argument to do things like your catastrophic fund, to help out Barbados, to help out other countries. But what is the economic and financial case for doing that? Why should wealthy countries help poorer nations through creating these instruments, through funding these instruments? What's the financial reason?
Well, the financial argument is that in a world that is less secure, more shock-prone, the impact of disasters in one place can travel far away. Just think about the continent of Africa being hit by droughts. What it means is people in desperation run to Europe. We are interconnected. The second part of the argument is if developing countries are falling further behind, the global economy shrinks. And when it shrinks, that affects everybody. I also want to add that when we look at the picture of emission increase, if the rich countries do not facilitate investment in mitigation in the developing world, guess what? It doesn't matter what they do at home because emissions in the developing world would skyrocket. So that interdependence we have to embrace and then act accordingly.
We have a question from the audience. Benjamin Bartle from New York asked, what innovative approaches or partnerships do you see as most critical to unlocking the trillions of dollars required to meet both mitigation and adaptation goals? And how can we ensure that these funds are accessible and effectively deployed where needed most?
Well, for me as a head of international organization, it is absolutely essential that we all, the IMF, the World Bank, the regional development banks, work as a system, that we pool our resources and capabilities and we deploy them as a coordinated approach to financing. And then we aim to identify what are the obstacles for private finance to go into countries. And then again, work together to eliminate these obstacles. There is, I will name two things in which we are working. It is something that is absolutely essential to answer this question, to address. One is foreign exchange risk. If you are attracting investment in, say, wind and other forms of renewable energy, and you know that the return on your investment is going to be pretty good, but you are lending in dollars or other currencies, and you are collecting the payback in local currency, which may shrink by the time you start receiving the payback. You are genuinely hugely interested in figuring out how to manage this foreign exchange risk. Or if you are an investor that is going in a high-risk environment, you want to know you're not going to be let fall on your face in the first instance of trouble. So you would be very keen to have a first loss guarantee of a kind. So working on these things, they're not easy, by the way. This is not trivial. Working together to eliminate risks. And for the fund, help our countries to have strong fundamentals, good policies, good institutions. So all other things equal, they create more confidence for actions. One thing, can I add one?
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that we all should be very focused on is how can we create an environment for policymakers to make good decisions? Because policymakers, and I was listening to the German colleague, they are faced with a very complicated trilemma. They have the objective of climate action, accelerate mitigation and adaptation, one. They have the objective of fiscal consolidation because the last years have lifted up their debt burden. And they have the objective of acceptance of the public of measures they take. So climate action means what? Spend more. Fiscal consolidation means what? Spend less. Public acceptance means what? Don't tax me, don't raise carbon price. How we work to help decisions to be taken when we have these contradictory objectives. It's not trivial. And there, what we do at the fund is we try to show to countries the costs and benefits of different choices and help them navigate decisions that ultimately would be good for people, good for our planet.
Thanks for that explanation. We're running a little bit low on time, as fascinating as this is. But I want to ask you, we're kind of in a moment where we have historic levels of deployment of clean energy and investment in clean energy, despite the barriers to getting more finance mobilized. But we're also seeing more extreme weather events. We are seeing ongoing emissions increases and the challenges of AI and how that will contribute to increased emissions. What are your areas of concern and what are your areas of hope in this current moment we're in?
Well, my main concern is that we are so much running against time. This decade is absolutely critical. If we don't trim down the emissions significantly more, our analysis says if all the promises we have made are implemented, we will cut emissions by 12% in this decade. If we want 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have to cut emissions by 50%. So this is my biggest concern, that we are running against time. What is my optimism? It is the fact that we have made enormous progress in clean energy, clean mobility, and above all, we have Mother Nature helping us to see the way.
How so?
Well, by hammering us with the big hammer of hurricanes, droughts, floods. It is telling us, wake up, you people, you need to act. Thank you, Mother Nature.
Kristalina Georgieva, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for illuminating us.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Everyone, hang on. The conversation is going to continue. My colleague Maxine will be up next.